She was invisible. Just another black waitress moving through one of Seoul's most powerful dining rooms, refilling glasses nobody thanked her for, taking orders nobody looked up to give. But when the Korean mafia boss opened his mouth that Friday night, speaking about her in language he was absolutely certain she couldn't understand, she did something that stopped every conversation in that restaurant cold. Every single one. And before the night was over, and a man who had spent 30 years making people disappear found himself disappearing instead. You need to hear this story. Welcome. While you're here, hit subscribe and drop a comment. Tell me where in the world you're watching from, because this community is built on stories that remind us who we really are. And here is what I know to be true. The people the world works hardest to overlook are almost always the ones carrying the most dangerous thing of all, knowledge. Or that's exactly what happened to Amara Osei, a PhD scholar from Ghana who found herself carrying plates in Gangnam, Seoul, wearing a black vest and a white shirt, moving through rooms full of people who never once wondered what was behind her eyes. They should have wondered, because behind those eyes was 6 languages, a doctoral dissertation on Korean criminal underworld linguistics, and 3 years of research that meant she understood every single word Kwon Dae-jung said that night. Every single word. But before we get to that restaurant, before we get to the silence, the shock, and the moment that cost a mafia boss his empire, you need to understand how a woman like Amara Osei ends up invisible in the first place. There was a box under Amara's bed in her Itaewon apartment. She looked at it every night before she slept and every morning before she left for work. Inside it was everything she used to be. This is the story of how she got it all back, and then some. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. Amara remembered it the way you remember the last good day before everything changes, with a clarity so sharp it almost hurts to touch. She was sitting in Professor Mensah's office at the University of Ghana, watching the old man's hands tremble slightly as he held the envelope. He had been her academic father for 6 years. She had never once seen him nervous. He looked up. His eyes were wet. "Seoul National University," he said quietly. "The full doctoral fellowship. They want you, Amara. They specifically asked for you." She called her mother from the car park outside. Her mother cried so hard she couldn't speak for a full minute, just held the phone and wept the way mothers weep when a lifetime of sacrifice suddenly makes sense. That was 4 years ago. The research she was going to Seoul to finish wasn't ordinary work. Her dissertation, Power, Silence, and Linguistic Dominance in East Asian Organized Crime Networks, had started as a curiosity and grown into something that made her professors uncomfortable in the best possible way. Amara had spent 3 years mapping how Korean criminal organizations used language not just to communicate, but to control. The coded slang, the deliberate exclusions, the way certain dialects functioned as walls, keeping outsiders out and keeping members locked in. She had cross-referenced court transcripts, police linguistics reports, undercover recordings, and academic analyses from Seoul, Tokyo, and Busan. She didn't just speak Korean, she had dissected it at its most dangerous. 6 languages lived in her head: English, Korean, Twi, Mandarin, Japanese, French, and she moved between them the way a musician moves between instruments. Naturally, without thinking, each one a different door into a different world. Her soul felt like coming home to a world she had built in her mind before she ever set foot in it. She loved the university library at night, the particular silence of serious study, the way her Korean colleagues slowly stopped staring at her face once they read her work. She loved how the city felt ancient and electric at the same time. She was 26 years old, sharper than she had ever been, and for the first time in her life, she felt exactly where she was supposed to be. And then her phone rang. It was her mother. But it wasn't her mother's voice. It was something smaller, carefully controlled, the voice her mother used when she was trying not to fall apart. Her father's fishing business. The loans he had taken quietly, without telling anyone. The debt that had finally come to collect. Her twin brothers, Kofi and Kwame, 14 years old, their school fees 2 months unpaid, pulled from class and sent home. "Your father won't ask," her mother said. "Hey, so I'm asking." The medicine her mother needed cost more each month than Amara's stipend. The brothers needed school fees. The debt needed servicing. The numbers were not complicated. The choice was not complicated either, even though it broke something in her chest that she could still feel, even now, 2 years later. She booked the flight at 2 in the morning, sat on the edge of her bed in her Seoul apartment until sunrise, not sleeping, not crying, just sitting with the weight of it. She sent one email to the fellowship office, family emergency, indefinite leave. They replied 3 weeks later to say the position had been reassigned. She never went back. 2 years later, Itaewon studio apartment. Black vest, white shirt pressed the night before, shoes that had learned the exact layout of Hyeonggyum's floor. Before every shift, she stood at the small mirror above the bathroom sink and looked at herself for exactly 10 seconds. Not in vanity, in inventory. She was checking that the other Amara, the one with 6 languages and 3 years of criminal linguistics research, was properly tucked away where no one could see her. Then she picked up her bag and left. The box under her bed held her unfinished dissertation, her fellowship letter, and a photograph of her mother taken on the day the acceptance came. She looked at it every night before sleep. It was the last thing she saw before closing her eyes. And tonight, for reasons she couldn't name yet, she looked at it longer than usual. It started with a phone call to the front desk at 6:47 p.m. Amara was resetting table 4 when she noticed Manager Park take the call. She wasn't watching him deliberately. She had simply learned, over 2 years, to notice things. The way his shoulders dropped first, then stiffened. The way his free hand found the edge of the host's stand and gripped it. And the way he turned slightly away from the dining room before he spoke, as though the walls shouldn't hear. He hung up, stood still for 3 full seconds. Then he turned and found the floor supervisor with his eyes, and something passed between them that had no words. Within 90 seconds, the entire staff knew. Amara could read it moving through the room like a current. The junior servers suddenly finding things to straighten, the sommelier checking and rechecking his cart, as the kitchen pass-through going quieter than usual. Nobody announced anything. Nobody had to. This was the language of controlled fear, and Hyeonggyum's staff were fluent in it. Manager Park walked the floor once, adjusting nothing, seeing everything. When he passed Amara, he said only, "Table 7 tonight. Best service. No mistakes." He didn't meet her eyes when he said it. Kwon Dae-jung arrived at 8:15 p.m. He did not hurry. Men like him never did. And hurrying implied somewhere more important to be, and there was no such place, not in his world. He came through the entrance the way weather comes, preceding itself. The 2 associates flanking him were identical in their dark suits and their silence, positioned not beside him but around him, like punctuation marks that existed only to frame what mattered. The woman on his arm wore a silver dress that caught every light in the room. Her posture was immaculate and completely rigid, the practiced composure of someone performing calm rather than feeling it. She had not chosen this evening. That much was readable from across the restaurant. And then there was Kwon himself. Sharp black suit, black tie, silver-streaked hair swept cleanly back from a face that had long since stopped arranging itself for other people's comfort. He was not tall, but he occupied space the way tall men envied, completely, without apology. That his eyes moved across Hyeonggyum the way an owner's eyes move across a property. Slow, assessing, already aware of every exit. He was 53 years old and had spent 30 of those years building the Cheongnyong, the Blue Dragon Syndicate, into one of the most quietly powerful criminal organizations in East Asia, construction contracts in Seoul, shipping operations out of Busan, nightclubs across Tokyo, and underneath all of it, see the darker architecture, the money that moved without paper trails, the prosecutors who developed convenient memory problems, the journalists who published retractions they hadn't written and never explained. 3 men who had threatened to expose him had retired abruptly from public life. None of them had been heard from since. He was not a man who needed to raise his voice. He chose table 7 without being guided to it. Corner position, back to the wall, sight lines to every table, both exits, on the kitchen pass-through, and the front entrance. He sat down, adjusted his cufflinks once, and opened the menu without looking at it. Manager Park appeared at Amara's elbow. "Table 7, he said again, quieter this time. Almost an apology. Amara looked across the room. She had read about men like Kwon Dae-jung in academic papers, studied the linguistic fingerprints they left in wiretapped conversations, traced the coded vocabulary their organizations used to conduct business in plain sight. She had written 40 pages on how men at exactly his level of the hierarchy communicated dominance without ever stating it directly. She knew what he was before she took a single step toward him. Her pen found her notepad. Her face arranged itself into the neutral professionalism she had spent 2 years perfecting. She began to walk, and halfway across the dining room, Kwon Dae-jung looked up from his menu, slowly, and with the unhurried certainty of a man who always knows when something has entered his orbit. His eyes found hers. He held them for exactly 1 beat too long. Then one corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. Something colder than that. He had found his entertainment for the evening. Amara reached table 7 at 8:19 p.m. She introduced herself the way she always did. Quietly, professionally, with the measured warmth that Haenyo required of its floor staff. And she asked if they had dined with them before. She mentioned the evening's specials. Her Korean was the careful, neutral Korean of hospitality, designed to be pleasant and forgettable. Kwon Dae-jung did not respond. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he is deciding the value of, not with anger, not with anything as honest as contempt, but with a slow, clinical appraisal that reduced her in the space of 4 seconds from a person to a curiosity. Then he turned to his associates and began to speak. What came out of his mouth was not the Korean of menus or pleasantries. It was the dialect Amara had spent 3 years inside, the gutter register slang of Gangnam's criminal underworld, the coded vocabulary she had cross-referenced across 40 police transcripts and 17 undercover recordings, the language that existed specifically because it sounded like casual conversation to everyone who wasn't supposed to understand it. And he was not discussing the menu. He was describing her. The words came fast and low, dressed in laughter, landing with surgical precision. He described her presence in his restaurant as an offense to his appetite. He used a term for black women that existed in exactly 2 of her academic sources, both classified. He made a comment about her uniform that his associates received with the loose, comfortable laughter of men who had laughed at such things many times before. The woman in silver said nothing. Her eyes dropped to the tablecloth and stayed there, her jaw set in the particular stillness of someone who has learned that looking away is the safest available option. Then Kwon turned back to Amara. He shifted registers deliberately, from the rapid underworld slang to something exaggerated and slow, the Korean adults use for very young children or the very confused. He leaned back in his chair with the relaxed authority of a man performing for an audience he owned. "Do you understand what a menu is?" he said, loudly enough for the tables nearest to them to hear the tone, if not the words. "Or should I use pictures?" His associates laughed harder. One of them picked up his wine glass, still smiling. Nearby diners turned. And not because they understood, but because laughter aimed at someone who isn't laughing has a sound that crosses language barriers without translation. Amara did not move. Her pen hovered above her notepad. Her face held its shape. From across the room, she looked like a professional absorbing a difficult table, patient, neutral, waiting it out. That was not what was happening inside her. Inside her chest, something was rising that had no clean name. Heat, yes, but older than anger. It was the accumulated weight of 2 years of invisibility pressing suddenly against a single point. It was the fellowship letter in a box under a bed in Itaewon. It was her mother's voice on the phone, carefully controlled, trying not to fall apart. It was Kofi and Kwame pulled out of school at 14. It was every table she had approached in this restaurant and every smile she had performed for people who looked through her as though she were made of glass. And underneath all of it, steady and precise and completely undeniable, was the knowledge. She understood every word Kwon Dae-jung had said, not approximately, not generally, every syllable, every coded layer, every criminal implication woven casually into his cruelty like wire inside silk. She had written her doctoral dissertation on exactly this dialect, and she had understood him from the first sentence with the clarity of a surgeon reading a scan. He had handed her a weapon and called it an insult. The restaurant seemed to slow around her. The laughter at table 7 faded to something distant. Her pen was still. The notepad was still. She was perfectly, completely still. And in that stillness, something shifted. She looked at Kwon Dae-jung. He was still smiling. She made her decision. You already know she didn't walk away, but what she did next, nobody in that restaurant was prepared for. Not the staff, not the associates. Not the woman in silver who had stopped staring at the tablecloth. Not even Kwon Dae-jung. Keep watching, because this is the part that changes everything. She did not raise her voice. That was the first thing people would remember afterward when they described it to their spouses over late dinners, to their colleagues over morning coffee, to anyone who would listen for months to come. She didn't shout. She didn't tremble. She didn't reach for the safety of English or the refuge of silence. And she simply looked at Kwon Dae-jung, directly, without blinking, without apology, and she spoke. What came out was his own language. Not the polished Korean of universities and broadcasters, not the careful hospitality Korean she had been using all evening. She spoke in the exact register he had used, the gutter dialect underworld slang of Gangnam's criminal underbelly, the coded vocabulary that existed specifically to exclude people like her from understanding. She repeated back to him, and with calm and surgical precision, exactly what he had said. Every phrase, every layered insult. She contextualized each one as she went, translating not just the words, but the specific criminal connotations embedded inside them, the way a linguist dissects a text, the way a prosecutor reads an indictment. She named the slang terms for what they were. She explained in his own dialect, in where each expression originated and what it signaled about the speaker's position in the Cheongnyong hierarchy. She didn't accuse him. She simply held a mirror up and described what was in it. The associate on his left stopped smiling first. Then the one on his right set down his wine glass with a small, careful click. Neither of them looked at Kwon. Neither of them looked at each other. The woman in silver looked up from the tablecloth. Then, without pause, without taking a breath, as fluidly as a river finding a new channel, Amara shifted. The underworld slang fell away completely. What replaced it was something else entirely. Classical Korean, the formal literary language of the Joseon court, the language of scholars, of ancient poetry, of texts that predated the modern city outside by 500 years. She spoke it the way it was meant to be spoken, measured, precise. At each syllable placed with the intentionality of someone who understood that language at its highest register was not just communication, it was architecture. She recommended the seasonal Haenyeo tasting menu. She described the first course, hand-dived abalone prepared in the style of Jeju's coastal grandmothers, in language so textured and specific that it ceased to be a description and became something closer to literature. She paired each course with a wine from the reserve collection, citing the vineyard, the harvest year, the precise reason each pairing honored the dish rather than competing with it. It took 90 seconds. It felt longer than that. Somewhere behind her, she heard the kitchen door. Head chef Kim Sang-hyun had been at Haenyeogyeom for 11 years. He had cooked for ministers, for celebrities, for men far more famous than Kwon Dae-jung. He was not a man given to leaving his kitchen mid-service for anything short of a fire. He was standing in the kitchen doorway now, just listening. The restaurant had gone completely, absolutely silent. Not the polite quiet of people minding their own business. The held-breath silence of an entire room that has just witnessed something it does not yet have words for. Wine glasses sat untouched. Chopsticks rested against porcelain. 2 women at table 9 had their hands pressed over their mouths without appearing to realize it. The woman in silver was staring at Amara with an expression that had moved entirely beyond surprise, past shock, past awe, into something that looked almost like relief, like she had been waiting a very long time to watch this exact thing happen. And Kwon Dae-jung. The color had moved up his neck slowly, the way color moves in a man who cannot believe what is happening to him in public. Not the hot red of anger, but the deep, a humiliated crimson of a man whose power has been disassembled in front of witnesses, not with aggression, not with confrontation, but with pure, irrefutable knowledge. The most dangerous thing in the room had been the woman he chose to humiliate. He understood that now. The silence stretched. Amara closed her notepad. She nodded once, professionally, pleasantly, exactly as she had been trained. Then she looked at Kwon Dae-jung and said in perfect, unhurried English, "I'll have that right out for you. Dangerous men don't stay down long." Amara had taken perhaps 4 steps away from table 7 when she heard it. The sharp, deliberate scrape of a chair against hardwood, loud enough to cut through every conversation in the room. The kind of sound that isn't accidental. The kind that is designed to turn heads. Every head turned. Kwon Dae-jung was standing. And he had composed himself with the speed of a man who had spent decades ensuring the world never saw him rattled for long. The crimson had left his face. What replaced it was something far more controlled, and therefore far more dangerous. The flat, absolute calm of a man who has decided how this evening ends. He did not shout. Shouting would have been almost manageable. What he did was worse. He dropped his voice to something low and precise and final, and he switched to English, slowly and deliberately, so that every person in Haenyeogyeom could follow every word. "This woman," he said, "just threatened me." He paused to let it settle across the room like a stone dropping into still water. "I want the owner. I want the police. And I want her removed from this building. Now." The gasps came in a wave. Not loud, refined people gasp quietly. But Amara felt it move through the restaurant like a pressure change. They both associates rose from their chairs in one synchronized motion, saying nothing, needing to say nothing. Their standing was its own sentence. Manager Park went the color of uncooked dough. Kwon reached into his jacket and produced his phone without hurry. He dialed a single number, raised it to his ear, and spoke 4 words in Korean. Whoever answered spoke 1 word back. Kwon lowered the phone, set it face down on the table with a small, final click, and looked across the room at Amara. And it was not a threatening look. That was what made it so cold. It was the look of a man reviewing a completed transaction, patient, certain, already thinking about the next thing. He had made calls like this before. Problems had resolved themselves afterward. They always did. Manager Park reached Amara in 12 steps. She counted them. He positioned himself between her and the room, his voice dropping to a desperate, apologetic murmur, the voice of a man trying to contain a fire with his bare hands. Amara. Her name in his mouth sounded like an apology. Please, he can have this restaurant closed by Monday. He can have my license pulled. He can... I know what he can do, she said quietly. Then please, wait in the back, just until this... He couldn't finish the sentence. There was no version of it that didn't sound like what it was. Amara stood still. She had been here before, not in a restaurant, not with a mafia boss standing 15 feet away, but in the essential architecture of the moment, yes. She had been here in every room that had looked at her presence and decided it was a problem to be managed rather than a person to be addressed. She had been here in the fellowship office that quietly reassigned her position without a single phone call. She had been here in 100 small erasures she had accepted because the alternative cost too much. She thought of the box under her bed. She thought of Kofi and Kwame back in school now, their fees paid on the strength of her aching feet and this black vest, and the smile she performed for tables that looked through her. She did not move. Around her, the room had fractured cleanly in two, and half the diners had found sudden interest in their plates. The careful self-preservation of people who know proximity to trouble is its own kind of danger. The other half were leaning almost imperceptibly forward, phones half raised, the instinct to document wrestling with the instinct to be discreet. At table 7, the woman in silver had not moved at all. Her hands were clasped in her lap, so tightly that her knuckles had gone pale against her dress. And her eyes were fixed on Amara with an expression that wasn't fear exactly. It was something more specific than that. Something that looked like a person who knew exactly how this story was supposed to end, and who was no longer certain it would. Then, from across the restaurant, the front door opened. It was not the person Amara expected. The front door had opened, and every head had turned toward it, braced for uniforms, for authority of the wrong kind, and for whatever Kwan's single phone call had set in motion. But the door had admitted only a couple, ordinary and unhurried, pausing at the host's stand. The real intervention came from inside the room. From the window table near the east wall, a man rose. He did it quietly. No scraping chair, no theatrical straightening, no performance of any kind. That he simply stood. And something about the quality of his stillness drew every eye in the restaurant the way a sudden silence draws attention more completely than a sudden sound. He was older, Korean, slight in build, wearing a charcoal suit with no tie. His hair was fully silver. His face held the particular unhurried calm of a man who had spent a lifetime sitting across from genuine power and had never once needed to raise his voice to be heard. He looked at Kwan Dae-jung. Before anyone contacts anyone, he said, I think it's worth noting something. His voice was conversational, almost gentle. The room was so quiet, it carried to every corner without effort. The security system in this establishment records continuously. A pause, brief and deliberate. Audio included. He let that land. And given that certain conversations at Table 7 this evening contained language directly referencing the Cheongyong Network's Busan operations, I suspect the chairman would prefer those recordings not reach the prosecutors my office briefed last Tuesday. The silence that followed was a different species from every silence that had come before it. This one had weight. Kwan's associate on the left turned to look at the one on the right. It was a single, fractional exchange, barely a movement at all. But Amara had spent years learning to read what men like these communicated in the spaces between words, and what passed between those two associates in that half-second was the oldest calculation in the criminal vocabulary: exposure, containment, exit. The phone on the table did not ring. Whoever Kwan had called was not calling back. Kwan Dae-jung stood completely still for a moment that seemed to stretch well beyond its actual length. Then, and with the controlled, deliberate movement of a man who refuses to let his body betray him even when everything else has, he sat back down, slowly. The room watched it happen, watched the power drain out of Table 7 like water finding a crack. And nobody said a word because sometimes justice arrives so precisely that commentary would only diminish it. The older man turned from Kwon. His expression changed, completely, immediately, the way a room changes when someone opens a window. And the coldness left his face, and what replaced it was warmth, quiet certainty, and something that looked very much like 8 months of relief finally finding its destination. He looked at Amara. "Dr. Osei," he said, "my name is Lim Jae-won. I am, or was until recently, senior advisor to the National Assembly. I wrote the organized crime reform legislation that is currently making the chairman's business arrangements considerably more complicated." He said it without satisfaction, as simply as context. "I have been trying to find you for 8 months. Your fellowship at Seoul National University was never formally closed." His voice was steady and unhurried, as though he were stating something that had always been true and simply needed saying aloud. "We don't abandon scholars like you, Dr. Osei. Seoul National University doesn't abandon scholars like you." "As I don't." Amara's composure, the composure she had constructed and maintained and worn like armor through 2 years of invisibility, through cruelty and injustice and every small erasure in between, cracked. Not completely, not loudly, just enough. A brightness at the corners of her eyes that she didn't blink away in time. One person began to clap. A woman at table 9, one of the 2 who had covered her mouth earlier. Then the man beside her. Then the table behind them. And the one behind that. And within seconds the entire restaurant was on its feet, and the sound of it filled Henyogeum from the wine rack wall to the kitchen doorway where Chef Kim still stood, and it was the most beautiful sound Amara had heard in 2 years. At table 7, Kwon Dae-jung stood for the second time that evening. He straightened his jacket. He said nothing. His associates fell into position around him, and they moved toward the exit with the careful and deliberate pace of men performing dignity they no longer possessed. The woman in silver did not stand. She watched Kwon Dae-jung walk to the door. She watched it close behind him. Then she turned back to the room, unclasped her hands from her lap for the first time all evening, and exhaled, slowly, completely, like someone setting down something very heavy after a very long time. She was not going to follow him. Not tonight. Not ever again. 3 months later, the Han River caught the morning light and held it. Amara watched it from her window, the water moving slowly below. Seoul spreading wide and unhurried on both banks, the city going about its ordinary business beneath an ordinary sky. She had stood at this window every morning for 11 weeks now, and every morning it still surprised her a little. Not the view, the fact of being the person standing at it. Her name was on the door behind her, both versions of it, Osei Amara in clean Hangul, and beneath it, Dr. Amara Osei in English. Director of Cultural and Linguistic Research, Seoul National University's Institute for Linguistic and Cultural Security. The title still felt like something she was growing into, the way a coat feels slightly large in the first weeks of winter, and then, one morning, fits exactly right. On her desk, beside her coffee and her lecture notes, sat a bound volume she had not yet grown accustomed to seeing in the world. Its cover was deep blue. Its title, I printed in both Korean and English, read, Power, Silence, and Linguistic Dominance in East Asian Organized Crime Networks. Government commissioned. Peer-reviewed. Cited already in 3 ongoing prosecutorial proceedings she was not permitted to discuss. The box that had lived under her bed in Itaewon was empty now. She had opened it the morning after the fellowship was reinstated and taken everything out slowly, the way you unpack something fragile, the research files, the fellowship letter, and the photograph of her mother. Everything that had been waiting in the dark was on shelves now, on walls, in the world where it had always belonged. On Sundays, her father called. The calls had grown longer each week, 10 minutes, then 20, then last Sunday, almost an hour. His fishing business was recovering slowly, rebuilt on a smaller and steadier foundation with the help of a microloan she had arranged through a university development contact. He didn't talk about the debt anymore. He talked about the water, about the boats, about Kofi's mathematics results, and Kwame's inexplicable new obsession with learning Japanese. Japanese, her father had said, laughing. Where does he get these ideas? Amara had not told him where. Her mother's medication was consistent now, the good kind, the kind that worked, covered entirely and without interruption. Her mother called on Thursdays, shorter calls, practical ones, full of grocery prices and neighborhood gossip, and the particular warmth of a woman who has stopped worrying and started simply living again. Her first lecture had been on a Wednesday morning in the university's largest graduate hall. She had arrived early and stood at the front watching the seats fill. Slowly at first, then quickly, then past capacity, students pulling chairs from the corridor, professors she recognized from published papers settling quietly into the back rows. That by the time she began speaking, the room was fuller than the fire code technically permitted. She spoke for 90 minutes. They leaned forward for all of it. Afterward, a young woman from Nairobi, first-year doctoral student, linguistics, the same program Amara had abandoned 2 years before, waited until the hall had emptied and then approached with the particular hesitance of someone who has something important to say and isn't sure yet if they're allowed to say it. I almost didn't come, she said. To Seoul, I mean. I almost turned it down. Amara looked at her for a moment. I know, she said. Come to my office Thursday. Bring your research proposal. There was one other thing. A woman named Seo Yeonji, who had once worn a silver dress to a dinner she hadn't chosen, had walked into Professor Lim's office 8 weeks ago and sat down and told him everything she knew. She knew a great deal. She had been at that table for 2 years, as present and silent and watching, filing information away with the careful patience of someone who was waiting for the right moment and the right witness. Kwon Dae-jung was under formal investigation. His associates had retained lawyers. The Cheongnyong Syndicate's Busan operations had been frozen pending review. Seo Yeonji was somewhere safe, somewhere new, beginning the particular difficult work of building a life entirely her own. Amara turned from the window, and Seoul spread out behind her, the city that had tried to make her invisible, that she had never stopped loving anyway. The city that had taken 4 years of her life, and then, in the space of one Friday evening, handed all of them back with interest. Because here is what Kwon Dae-jung never understood. The people you try to silence have usually already survived things that would have broken you. They have already made the impossible choices, carried the unbearable weight, packed their brilliance into boxes and slid them under beds and kept moving anyway. You cannot silence what has already learned to survive in the dark. Amara Osei didn't find her voice that night in the Golden Diver. She simply stopped letting the wrong people tell her it didn't exist. And now she spends every single day in that office, at that window, in that lecture hall, making sure that no young woman from Accra or Nairobi or anywhere else ever has to carry her brilliance in a box under a bed, waiting for someone to remember her. She remembered herself, and that, in the end, was more than enough. If this story moved you, if some part of Amara's journey felt familiar, if you've ever packed your own brilliance away and told yourself it was practical, it was temporary, it was fine, then this is for you. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Someone who has been invisible too long. Someone who has been waiting for permission to take up space they were always entitled to. And if you're watching from somewhere in the world where Amara's choice makes complete sense to you, drop it in the comments. Tell me where you are, because this community was built on exactly this: the belief that the people the world overlooks are almost always the ones with the most powerful things to say. I subscribe. Stay. There are more stories like this one waiting for you, and none of them are about people who gave up.